Hey guys, and welcome back for today's video where I want to go over a handful of polls that have come out in recent days, and in general not seeing big overall changes in the numbers, but I will say there is a bit more positive over this past week for the Bernie Sanders camp than what we had been seeing in weeks prior. Now, not quite as much the case in the first poll that I'm going to be touching on here, and this is from the Morning Consult. Their weekly numbers still have Joe Biden in first place at 32%, followed by Elizabeth Warren at 21%, and then Bernie Sanders right there at 19%. And Warren and Sanders have been really close in these Morning Consult polls for a while now, while Warren has leapfrogged past Sanders over the past couple of weeks. But in the other polls that I'm going to be touching on today show a little bit of a different story where it feels like Sanders could possibly be leapfrogging past Elizabeth Warren, and it's basically a situation where these two are extremely close with their numbers that we're seeing in poll after poll, and basically tied for second place with all the data that we're seeing. But in general, I do think it is a little bit more of a positive story right now from Sanders, given the fact that there was this perception that he was quickly receding and losing ground and becoming the clear third place, where I think the data that we're seeing right now, it's pretty much a neck-and-neck tie for second place, or maybe even Sanders leapfrogging a little bit past Warren in some of these polls that we're going to get to. But before touching on those other polls, I also want to say another very positive piece of news that came out from the Bernie camp today, and that is the Q3 fundraising numbers, where Sanders raised $25.3 million from 1.4 million donations, and that 25.3 million number is the highest of any candidate that we've seen in any quarter thus far during campaign season of these 2020 Democratic hopefuls. Now, we haven't gotten the numbers out from the other campaign. We'll see how the other numbers compare to what Bernie was able to post here in the third quarter. And if it's really interesting in the data that we're seeing, I'll potentially make a separate video just talking about that, but we'll see how these other camps decide to release their numbers. And it is a different playing field here for Bernie and some of these other candidates, because obviously he's not taking that big donor money. It's all grassroots, and the fact that he's doing just as well, if not better, than these other candidates that are taking that big donor money, it just shows the grassroots network of support behind his candidacy. That means he is still a force to be reckoned with as we go into the 2020 primary season. All right, now going into some of these other polls. This one is from Ipsos, and we see that Sanders, he was losing to Elizabeth Warren last week by 1 percentage point. You had Warren at 14, Bernie at 13, but this week he's up to 15 points, so gaining 2, while Warren is staying there at 14 percentage points. Also a couple points receding for Joe Biden, down to just 18% of support amongst the All-Americans that were polled in this particular Ipsos poll. You see the registered voters, Biden doing a little bit better amongst that demographic, up to 21%, with Warren at 15 and Bernie Sanders at 16 points. But this is what I was saying, where we're not seeing huge changes in the numbers, but we are seeing maybe a little bit more positive from Sanders with the numbers that he's been able to post in some of these polls over the past week. Going over and taking a look at head-to-head matchups between these upper-tier Democratic hopefuls and Republican President Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is still the president by the time we actually get to this election, it'll be interesting to see how those impeachment proceedings play out. But we can see last week Biden had a 5-point lead over Trump, and that's the same that he's seeing in this week's numbers. But big gains here for Bernie Sanders. Last week he had a 1-point lead over Trump. This week up to 6 percentage points in his lead, and actually 1 point better than the Biden versus Trump matchup, what we're seeing in these results. And then we have Elizabeth Warren was ahead of Trump by 2 points last week, ahead of him by 4 points amongst all Americans in this week's number. So she's also doing a little bit better in those numbers. But the best overall head-to-head matchup amongst all Americans, and it's close, but still Bernie Sanders is just doing a little bit better than what we're seeing from the other two top-tier Democratic hopefuls. So another positive number for him in this Ipsos poll. Moving over, taking a look at this week's Rasmussen numbers. Actually, Joe Biden doing slightly better, up to 30% of support. He had receded below that 30-point line. And then we see second place, Bernie Sanders at 16%. And in third place, just by a one vote difference there. You had Bernie Sanders at 205 out of this 1322 sample size. You had Elizabeth Warren at 204 at 15%. So essentially tied in that result that we were getting. Now moving over to some state-specific CNN polls. And this one is out of the state of Nevada, and we can see Biden and Sanders tied at the top, each at 22% of support, followed by Elizabeth Warren, who is at 18% of support. And also what I found pretty interesting about these Nevada numbers is when they asked the voters Which Democratic candidate do you think would best handle these different areas of policy? And Sanders won in every single category. Healthcare, by far the best in this one, up to 32%. Also 24% leading the way in the climate crisis, 21% leading the way on gun policy, 24% on the economy, and 21% on immigration. So in the state of Nevada, some pretty positive numbers for Bernie Sanders. And with these early primary and caucus states, I'm actually to the point where if I had to put money on it, I'd say either Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders are going to win Iowa and New Hampshire, and then possibly Sanders in Nevada. That's might be where I'd put my money at it right now, especially with the fact that Sanders does very well with Hispanic voters, and that is an important block there in the state of Nevada. That could be a situation where you have the perceived frontrunner Joe Biden, or at least the guy that's ahead nationally in the polls, where he could lose the first 3 states. And if that's the result, that can have a big impact on what happens in the state after that point. Now, the area where Joe Biden should have a lot of success during primary season is in the southeastern states, and the early southeastern state is South Carolina. And here is a poll that we're getting out of the state of South Carolina that continues to show very strong numbers for Joe Biden, leading the way at 37% support, followed by Elizabeth Warren at 16% and Bernie Sanders at just 11 percentage points. And the Sanders camp definitely hoping that he can do a bit better this time around in those southeastern states. We'll see if he's able to do that, and they'll get an early test in if that is the case or not in South Carolina. And then we take a look at who the South Carolina voters think would best handle these different policy areas. And it's not a big surprise that they have the confidence in Joe Biden, who is the candidate that they're overwhelmingly supporting here. But they have Joe Biden there in first place on healthcare, which is kind of a surprise to me. But you see behind him, Sanders at 17, Warren at 16. Perhaps the South Carolina voters don't want a whole lot of change to what we're seeing in the healthcare system, which isn't typically the norm amongst Democratic primary voters in the kind of changes that they'd like to see in the healthcare system. And then beyond that, the climate crisis, Joe Biden leading, as well as gun policy, the economy, and immigration. And those are all the polls that I wanted to touch on here in today's video. But you can see that there are some more positive numbers coming in for the Sanders camp than what we had seen in prior weeks, specifically this Nevada poll where he's tied in first place with Joe Biden, and then the Rasmussen and Ipsos polls where he's just a little bit above Elizabeth Warren, but they're essentially tied for second place. And then we had that more positive poll for Warren back in the morning consult numbers where she's just a little bit above Bernie Sanders. But those who are calling for Sanders to drop out of the race just because we've had some weeks where there are some polls where Elizabeth Warren has pulled ahead of him, they're essentially tied in that second place result. And also, you definitely should not be dropping out of the campaign that you're running when you're bringing in these kind of numbers. That third quarter number, 25.3 million from 1.4 million donors. Bernie Sanders has the strongest grassroots network of support, the most donors, and the most donors from the occupations that you typically feel are more likely to vote for Democratic candidates. When we see those numbers, they are pretty interesting and just shows that Bernie has a lot of people that are dedicated to his campaign and looking for him to have success as they donate that grassroots money and effort into his campaign to try to have success. So those are the numbers that we're seeing out of some of the polls that have come out in recent days. And like I said, as we get more of these third quarter fundraising numbers out of these different camps, if it's interesting data, I might make a separate video talking about that, but we'll see how transparent some of these other candidates are in releasing the numbers that they were able to raise fundraising-wise in the third quarter. So I appreciate you guys stopping on in. Consider subscribing for more of my content, and I hope to see you guys back here for my next video.